Heather Caldwell from the Ringwood Library. We are starting a simple STEM series of videos that you can do at home. Today we're going outside. Even though you're stuck at home, you can get out into your yard or you can get out onto a hiking trail. So I'm going to show you some things to look for in nature today. It is early spring and most of the trees have not started getting their leaves yet. Most of the trees around here are deciduous. That means they lose their leaves in the winter time. However, right now, if you look into the woods, you can see light green forming at near the ground level. And that is all the smaller bushes, shrubs, and trees getting their leaves before the taller trees get their leaves and block the sunlight. That's a nice evolutionary adaptation for the smaller plants and bushes in the forest. So even near wet areas, you will notice ferns and skunk cabbage starting to come out. With deciduous trees, right now, they don't have their leaves. We can't identify the trees from their leaves. But there are other ways to identify trees without looking at their leaves. And I'm going to show you one example here. This is a birch tree. Birch trees are known for their papery bark. So you might be familiar with the white birch trees with the thin papery bark, but this is a heavier, curlier papery bark. So that's a birch tree. You can take a look for one of those on your nature hike today. So we've talked about deciduous trees, but I'm also going to talk about evergreen plants. You may be familiar with pine trees with the pine needles and pine cones, but there are other types of evergreens, plants that stay green throughout the year. So I'm going to show you a couple right now. This is what I call a creeping myrtle plant, also known as periwinkle for its blue flowers or purple flowers. It's a vinca vine. It is a ground cover, but if you look at the leaves, they stay green all year, and they are pretty hardy. They have a waxy covering to protect themselves from the weather. Up here, we have another evergreen plant. This is hollybush. They are pretty identifiable by their leaves, the shape of their leaves. They are a little pricky on the ends. And they do get berries in the winter. This is a newbie. You may have holly bushes in your yard that can grow to be a couple of feet taller than me. With deciduous trees, sometimes they don't always lose their leaves. Scientists don't really know why. They think maybe younger trees are trying to protect their leaf buds, or they're holding onto the leaves for extra nutrition. So they usually find this happening in younger trees. So you can see these trees haven't lost their leaves. Obviously they're not green anymore, but the leaves are still hanging on. This is called marcescence. All right, let's move along. Oftentimes on a hike you'll come across a stream, and in streams you will find, or near streams, you'll find ferns, skunk cabbage, and frequently you'll see moss-covered rocks. Do not confuse moss with lichen. There is a difference. So moss is a spongy-like plant that is very green. Lichen oftentimes lichen will be a greenish color. It's kind of a scabby, scaly looking thing on a rock or on a log. Lichen is actually a fungus living with a blue-green algae or a blue-green bacteria. They're in a symbiotic relationship. They help each other live. But a lichen is a fungus, whereas moss is a plant. Speaking of fungi, let's go over here. Oftentimes when you go on a hike, you'll see dead trees lying on the ground. Sometimes, occasionally, you'll see a dead tree still standing. On these dead trees, oftentimes there's fungus growing. A fungus is part of its own kingdom in the natural world. It is not a plant. A fungus is considered a decomposer, which means that it will help living material decay after it dies, so that all of this wood will eventually go into the ground and become nutrients for something else to grow. So speaking of new growth, we have the leaves coming out on this barberry bush. You can see some of the berries hanging on from the winter. You may know these as pricker bushes because they do have little thorns on them. So that is something that you can go out and look for that is starting to come out right now. Also, in many gardens, one of the earliest flowers to come out are daffodils. Usually they're planted in gardens. These are bulb flowers, and they apparently were kind of thrown out with unwanted garden material, and they seem to thrive here in the middle of the woods. So I hope I've given you some new things to look for when you go outside into nature. Look for lichen and look at what the difference between lichen and moss is. Look for fungus growing on dead logs or dead trees. Look for the new growth, new flowers, new leaves coming out, and enjoy. And I will see you next time when we talk about carbon dioxide.